great to see so many people still here. This is great, actually. Thank you, everyone. We're going to make a start because we are a little bit behind schedule. And joining me, and we talked earlier, actually, in the last session, we just had that image up there. We talked about somebody looking like their profile photo. And my next guest looks exactly like hers, even down to the dress, which made it very easy to spot her in the crowd. So my next guest is the very wardrobe-coordinated Linda Freiner. She is Group Head of Sustainability at Zurich Insurance. Linda joined the insurance company a decade ago and is responsible for global strategy development and integration of sustainability across the group. Prior to joining Zurich, Linda worked at Procter & Gamble and the World Economic Forum as well. So, Linda, to begin with, how do you actually define climate resilience? And why is it important for communities and industries in the face of climate change?
Well, first of all, with the dress, I only own one business dress. Otherwise, you always see me in sneakers and of course, as a sustainability professional in a Patagonia shirt. So that's the reality. When it comes to climate resilience, it's really about a system's ability to withstand and recover from the impacts of climate risk, and in particular, of course, the physical climate risk in this asset. And it's really about how do we implement efforts to minimize the damage that physical climate risk can have. And of course, we are seeing more and more of that. We're seeing both the intensity and also the severity of it increasing very, very rapidly.
Okay, and can you share some examples of successful climate adaptation strategies that have been implemented by different organisations or different communities?
I think I can look at three. So let's look at the community and government and business perspective. I actually joined Zurich 10 years ago to work on a flood resilience specific program that was really about creating and enhancing resilience to floods in vulnerable communities in the global south, where we as an insurance company could bring the risk management expertise and also understanding of climate hazards. And there it's really about being understanding what are the livelihoods that these communities depend on and what can you do to really help increase the resilience of that, whether it is the agriculture, whether it's the fishing, whether it's housing, whether it's early warning systems. So there's quite a lot, but you have to work locally in the communities. If we look at governments, I mean, one of the reasons that we're seeing so devastating impact of climate change, it's not only that the hazard had become worse, but also that we've built houses and infrastructure that in places that should never have been urbanized in the first place. If we see in the US typically, I mean, the last 20 years, the urbanization in areas exposed to wildfires has increased by 40%. So we've actually built there. And so there, it's really about for governments to make sure that we have the right land planning and urbanization, but also that they help communities that are in harm's way to really move out of there and find a new place. But that demands a lot of collaboration, of course. And then finally, when it comes to business, and many of you are sustainability professionals, and I was listening to the Net Zero Planet session, and yes, we focus a lot on climate mitigation. But the reality is we also need to look at climate resilience and adaptation and not just leave that to the risk managers in our company to do, but actually working in tandem. And there it's really about understanding the risk exposure and also identify the measures that have done out. And we've done actually creating a service around this where we now work with businesses to really model the risk and understand the exposure. And then we actually go out on sites, on the locations of the businesses and really identify the different adaptation needs and then help them implement that. So it has to also be very local in its approach.
Now, one of the topics we talked about in that previous session that you mentioned was time, I suppose, and talking about the sort of the short-term vision and the long-term view, if you like, and how you sort of marry those. So how can we strike a balance between implementing short-term adaptation measures and investing in long-term sustainable solutions for climate resilience? The kind of thing that you might not see, immediate short-term gains, but you're playing that long game. How do you strike the balance?
It's a really hard one to strike, and because the answer is, of course, we need to do both. But a lot of insights can be gained from on short-term basis of really understanding the risk and understanding the hazards. And we've seen that, especially when we work in communities, is that the measures that you can take are not that complicated, and you can actually get effects quite fast compared to a business where it's really about long-term investings. And I think there it's about, again, making sure that you plan in advance and plan ahead. And what really helped is that as insurance companies, we used to be very dependent on CAT modeling, so catastrophic modeling, where we looked at historical data from hundreds of years back. The reality is that is not enough anymore because the hazards are changing so fast and the patterns. So we actually need to do climate risk modeling. So we have to try to look into the future. But you all know we don't have none of us have a crystal ball, so it's really hard. But you still have to try to make a bit of that assumptions of what is going to be the impact of the risk in the long term.
And whose responsibility is climate resilience? I mean, is it governments? Is it businesses in the private sector, or is it individuals, or is it a mixture of those?
It has to be a mixture because there's some real, and especially if you look at it from societal level, there are some real investments that are going to have to be done, and that's going to have to be done by governments. But business can, of course, support that. For example, in Australia, in Queensland, an area which is very exposed to flooding, and where areas almost became insurable. So insurance companies pulled out of there. And then the government decided to invest in building a levee to protect the communities from flooding. So the insurance companies came back, and actually the premiums fell by almost 90% because of that levee had been done. So that investment needs to come, and then business can come and support the community.
Okay, so that's talking about the broader industry, I suppose. Let's talk about Zurich a little bit. How is Zurich, your company, adapting to climate change risks and implementing these resilience building measures?
I mentioned very much that we've started a separate business that actually looks at providing climate resilient solutions and actually really encouraging our customers. Actually separate from the insurance side, where we of course provide the risk transfer solutions and we try to help them to get the right protection, but actually coming in and looking at the location by location and really trying to provide those advices have a huge impact. And then they can choose to insure them or not. That's up to them, but we have a very hard line between the insurance and the solutions side.
So that's interesting. So obviously there's been quite a lot of natural events, if you like, in the US, just looking at some examples, where insurance companies have not paid out, should we say. Is that a case of, you can't blame the insurance companies for that, it's the people who are living in these areas, and you alluded to it earlier, really, talking about the growing wildfires and people living in areas that really they've got no right to live in. There's better places for these people to live. So in a way, by making those households or areas uninsurable, does that help to drive change? Does that help to move people away from those areas?
The reality is that we need to change behaviors. That's the only thing we know work. And we talked about that, and the Net Zero Planet discussion was really very much about we need to change culture, we need to change behaviors. And it's the same when it comes to climate resilience and adaptation. The worst thing we can do is to have government insurance schemes, because we've seen that, where basically the government compensates to people after disaster. But what happens is, of course, that people take that compensation money, they go and they rebuild their house in the same area with the same building codes, and guess what? Next flood comes or next storm comes, so we're in this vicious circle. So we as an insurance company always need to send a price signal that this is a risk. I don't think that the world is going to become uninsurable. I think it's going to be expensive if we do not do something today to really understand where the exposure comes from. So, and I always say there's no natural disasters, because all the disasters in the end are oftentimes, except for volcanoes and earthquakes, are man-made. Back to we've actually built houses and infrastructure in places that shouldn't be there.
Yeah, and there are challenges there as well, because as you said, the insurance can get very expensive, and that causes its own problems where it impacts some socio-economic groups more than others. And what you tend to get are people who can afford the insurance rebuilding those houses bigger with the insurance payouts, and it's forcing other people out of those areas as well. So it creates like a ghetto almost of the insured and the uninsured. How can the industry help to mitigate that or change it? Or is this just market forces? Is it just supply and demand and cost that naturally levels that playing field?
Governments play a huge role, as I said, in terms of land planning, urbanization, and in terms of also education. But the insurance industry also have a responsibility of educating people and really getting to understand what risk is and what's the exposure and so on. It's really hard because we're always standing in front of what we call moral hazard, right? It's not going to happen to me until it happens to me. So there needs to be an interplay between the communities, between the insurance industry, between the governments as well. So it's not an easy one to solve.
Not an easy one to solve, no. Do we have any questions from the audience at all?
I feel like we've been fast and furious here to make sure to get you back on time.
Yeah, we have been fast and furious. Okay, I've got one more question here. This has come in from our app, so 1 second. Okay, this is more looking into the future, and I know we've sort of touched on this as well. But as an insurer, how does Zurich envision contributing to a more sustainable and resilient future? So looking ahead to the future, I suppose, in the next, let's say, 18 months to 2 years, what immediate steps are you taking to improve sustainability?
One is, of course, that we are trying to influence governments when it comes to land planning, when it comes to building codes and really how they approach climate resilience and adaptation, because we see that the expertise is missing. And then it's, of course, back with our customers to actually also in the same way helping them and better understand their exposure and making sure that they are resilient. And then, as I mentioned as well, in the communities. And that's something where we do already. We've been doing that for the past 10 years, and we continue to do so. So it's a very important work. And we look at this on a short-term basis as well as on a long-term basis. We have to do both.
And on a personal level, what keeps you awake at night worrying when it comes to insurance?
Wow, that's a very good question. I think it's really about how fast are we going to be able to mitigate climate change, and what are going to be the impacts. I think we know maybe until 2030, but beyond 2030 we have no idea. And I also get a bit annoyed when we talk about a 1.5 future as a goal. It's a limit, and beyond that limit, the trigger points are already starting to kick in. And for an insurance company, this is really, really worrying things that definitely keeps us awake at night.
I think it keeps all of us awake at night, to be fair, doesn't it? Okay, if there's no questions from the audience, we will leave it there. Thank you so much, Linda. Really great insights. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.